Welcome, dear friends, to another evening of quiet contemplation and filmic reverie here on Frame Shift. If you found your way here, I already know something about you. You see movies not just as stories flickering on a screen, but as reflective glass, refracting something deeper, something human and aching and strange. You're the kind of person who doesn't mind slowing down, watching the shadows shift, listening to what remains unsaid between characters. You're not here for flashy ratings or plot summaries, but for that slow, simmering sense of something profound uncoiling beneath the surface. And to that end, tonight's film, Level 16 2018, is one I've been aching to talk about with you. Before we begin, if you enjoy these conversations, if you find yourself lingering with them afterward, thinking differently about the movies you watch, please consider subscribing and liking the video. Not out of obligation, but out of shared purpose. It helps more thinkers, more wanderers, more literature lovers find their way into this little corner we've carved out. Thank you for being here. And now let's step together into something cold, something eerie, and something, I think, profoundly relevant. I want to be clear, as I always am, this isn't your typical movie review. I'm not here to tell you whether you'll like the film or not, whether it's a must-watch or skippable. That's not our language here. What we're doing, what I've always felt called to do, is something slower, more deliberate. This is a theoretical exploration, an intellectual dive meant not just to analyze, but to awaken thought. This is cinema as text, as poem, as mirror. So settle in. This is for the readers of philosophy and the lovers of long walks, for those who remember scenes the way others remember dreams. The first time I watched this film, I remember how still I sat. It wasn't a jump scare movie. There weren't loud noises or things bursting through walls, but there was this creeping dread I felt in my chest, a physical stillness. I think it came from the cleanliness of it all, the order, the pallid light, the strange obedience of girls in identical uniforms, with identical lives, moving through identical hallways. I've seen a lot of dystopias over the years, some subtle, some screaming, but this one had a haunting quiet to it, like a secret boarding school where the rules have always been followed, but no one knows why. The film centers on a group of teenage girls who live in a sealed, highly controlled institution. They're taught lessons that sound like etiquette and civility, but beneath those words, purity, obedience, cleanliness, is something more disturbing. From the beginning, there's the suggestion of a hierarchy. Girls move through numbered levels as they age, like steps in a staircase toward they don't know exactly. All they know is that good behavior is rewarded, and misbehavior, however it's defined, is punished swiftly and without discussion. And isn't that the first breadcrumb, that notion of obedience divorced from purpose? Watching them, I felt flashes of things I'd read in Hannah Arendt, particularly her thoughts on the banality of evil. Here, evil doesn't snarl or shout. It whispers in routine. It hides in a daily schedule, in rituals and vitamins and perfumed lotion passed from hand to hand with unquestioning trust. For the girls, time is segmented into ritualistic routines. They wake, they cleanse. They sit in lessons where they learn how to be good women, though that term is never examined, only repeated. Their skin must be flawless, their tempers mild, their posture perfect. And yet, even as I watched them, perfect in posture, polite in speech, I felt an itch under my skin. Something was terribly wrong. The way their hands trembled just slightly before each injection. The way they flinched at raised voices. The way they never, ever questioned. There's something fascinating to me about how the film never lanes on overt exposition. It respects silence. And as a viewer, that silence became a kind of moral void. I found myself straining to understand, who are the adults running this place? What are their motivations? Why do these girls comply so readily? But instead of answers, I received gestures, glances, cold, sterile rooms. It reminded me of reading Kafka in college, and how the more I tried to make sense of the trial, the more trapped I felt by the senselessness of its bureaucracy. One of the most brilliant strokes in the film is the way it introduces cracks in the surface. A single girl, Vivian, is our tether, our protagonist. She is good, or tries to be. She follows the rules. She doesn't question. She's been burned before, quite literally, for trusting others. But when a former friend returns unexpectedly, Sophia, something shifts. There's a flicker in her gaze, a tremor of memory, and from that moment on, the film begins to peel itself back. I won't spoil the core twists, though you'll sense them coming. The story invites you to see past its facade, and once you do, it's impossible to unsee. But what I found most affecting wasn't the reveals themselves, it was the journey toward belief. The way the girls had to unlearn what they'd been taught, and how hard that was, because indoctrination doesn't live in the brain alone, it lives in the body, in habits, in muscle memory. There's a moment, quiet, almost forgettable, where Vivian stands before a mirror and touches her face, not with vanity, but with hesitation, like she's not sure the reflection belongs to her. That moment gutted me. I've felt that before, not in such dramatic circumstances, of course, but in the quiet crises that come when you realize a belief you held for years might not be true, that a system you trusted might have failed you, that you might have been shaped by something sinister, and now you must shape yourself anew. The world of the film is meticulously designed. Everything has a cold, metallic cleanness. The lighting is almost always dim, but never dark. It's the kind of perpetual dusk that never lets you fully wake. Doors are always closed. Windows, when they appear, are always locked. There's no natural light, no clocks. And time itself feels like it's been flattened, stretched across a smooth, gray floor. What's so devastating is how the girls normalize it. That's the true horror, not the sinister purpose that's eventually revealed, but the way they accept their world as given. The way they've been taught not just to obey, but to doubt their instincts. That resonated deeply with me. I grew up in a household where obedience was often valued over curiosity, where asking why could be met with silence or scorn, and I remember how long it took me to untangle that, to understand that questioning wasn't betrayal, but liberation. In the story, Vivian and Sophia slowly begin to see the system for what it is. Their friendship rekindles something brave in both of them, a willingness to speak, to trust, to remember, but it's a dangerous path. And the deeper they go, the more perilous their discoveries become. There's a specific kind of terror in watching a child, or a teenager, learn that the world they've trusted is a lie. It's not the lie itself that breaks them. It's the knowledge that they were meant to never know, and yet the film doesn't revel in despair. There is, even in its coldest corridors, a flicker of warmth, a sense that awakening, though painful, is possible. That reclaiming the self is not just an act of resistance, but a kind of rebirth. Watching Vivian move from obedience to agency reminded me of the literature I love most, Jane Eyre, Offred, even Antigone. Women who were told to be silent, to be good, to be still, and who instead chose to speak. As the narrative approaches its climax, the pace quickens, but never frantically. There's a steady, breathless rhythm to the final act, like watching someone walk a tightrope in slow motion. You know they might fall, you hope they don't, and every step feels like a prayer. I won't tell you what they discover. I won't tell you how it ends. You deserve to see that for yourself. But I will say this, the ending is earned, not in spectacle, but in truth. It doesn't need explosions or dramatic monologues. It leaves you with a different kind of intensity, the kind that stays in your chest hours after the credits roll. And maybe that's what I cherish most about this film. It doesn't shout, it whispers, it trusts you to listen. And if you stay with it, you might just find yourself changed. Not dramatically, not all at once, but quietly, subtly, like the way dawn creeps across a windowsill before you're fully awake. So thank you for being here, for watching, for thinking, for diving deep into a story that some might overlook, but that holds so much under its surface. That's what we do here on Frame Shift. We look deeper, we think longer. And we remember that every story, no matter how small, holds a key to something larger. Until next time, stay curious, stay thoughtful, and don't be afraid to question the world around you. Sometimes the questions themselves are the beginning of freedom. Of course, here is the 3,000-word cinematic narrative-style script exploring the first half of the plot, written exactly as instructed, flowing like a story, rich with atmosphere, character, and unfolding tension, without ever declaring itself as the first half. Let's begin. There's something unsettling about perfection, especially when it's silent, still, immaculately choreographed, a room where every object is in its place, where every face wears the same expression of quiet, measured obedience. One begins to wonder what's being hidden beneath the order. That's how it begins, with silence and symmetry. A row of young girls pressed into rigid postures on steel-framed beds, their skin porcelain pale beneath the low gray light. They're not frightened, not outwardly. But there's a tremor in the way they blink, a heaviness in their breathing, and from the moment we step into their world, we feel it, that gnawing sense that everything here has been scrubbed too clean. Vivian is among them, eyes wide, shoulders back, chin lifted just slightly higher than the others. There's an edge to her discipline, something sharper than simple obedience. It's as if she's carrying a memory no one else can see, a private wound just under the surface. And as the camera lingers on her face, we understand something without words. She's trying to be perfect because perfection here is survival. Time doesn't feel real in this place. There are no clocks, no windows to measure the passing of the sun, only routines. Wake, wash, dress, sit, wait, and then the blue light. It seeps under the door, cool and artificial, signaling the next phase of the day. There's a rhythm to it, days built from repeated actions, like a song with only one note. The girls shuffle through their lessons, how to be clean, how to be obedient, how to suppress emotion, how to never, ever touch their faces. A smudge of dirt, a moment of defiance, even an accidental outburst. These are sins, and sins are punished. not with shouting but with removal, correction, the kind that leaves no bruises but lingers anyway. What's eerie isn't the discipline, it's the absence of reason. The girls are told to be good, but no one tells them why. The lessons are memorized, recited like scripture, and yet their meaning remains elusive. A lady is patient. A lady is calm. A lady is clean. Over and over, as if repetition alone might conjure understanding. They are being trained for something, but that something is never named. Vivian, we come to learn, has been here longer than most. She's been burned both figuratively and literally, for trusting the wrong person, for stepping out of line. Years ago, she confided in a friend, Sophia, a soft-spoken girl with quick eyes and a hesitant smile. That trust led to punishment. Separation, pain, and now, after years of absence, Sophia has returned, moved up to Vivian's level 16, the final tier before. Something. Graduation, transfer, none of the girls know. None of them ask, but they feel it. Something changes at level 16. The rules are tighter, the surveillance more intense, the air heavier somehow. When Vivian sees Sophia again, the moment is brief, almost clipped. She pretends not to recognize her. There's too much at stake. Memories threaten to rise, but Vivian has trained herself to feel nothing, to want nothing, to obey. That's how she survived. But Sophia, older now, changed, has a glint in her eye that doesn't match the docility expected of them. She's watching, listening, waiting for something. Their days are structured with military precision. Each girl wakes in her own pod-like room, lit by a fluorescent square in the ceiling that mimics daylight but never quite convinces. Each room is identical, white walls, thin mattress, no personal items. Even their hygiene routines are monitored, cleansing stations that mist them in antiseptic spray, sinks that dispense measured amounts of water and lotion, vitamins delivered daily in little plastic cups. Their bodies are not their own, they are part of a system, maintained like machines. Once, Vivian lets her eyes linger too long on one of the guards during vitamin distribution. It's a small act, barely a second, but it earns her a warning. Her file is marked. She retreats further into herself, retraining every glance, every movement. The other girls notice, but no one speaks. Conversation is allowed only at specified times, and even then the topics are monitored. The vocabulary is limited, emotions discouraged, curiosity punished, but something shifts when a new round of injections begins. The girls are told they're for health, for longevity, for wellness. They don't ask questions, but after the shots they feel altered, sluggish, dull. Sophia, however, resists. She doesn't take hers. Somehow she's found a way to fake compliance, to pretend the needle pierced her skin when it never did. And now, for the first time, she's lucid while the others drift. It's then that she begins to whisper to Vivian. At first, just fragments. Questions: do you remember what happened before? Why do we never see anyone graduate? Vivian tries to shut it out. She wants no part of it, but Sophia keeps pressing, and something in Vivian starts to crack. She begins to look around differently, to notice the things she once ignored, the hidden cameras embedded in the walls, the inconsistencies in the staff's behavior, the way the air ducts hum slightly louder at night. There's a tension building now, like a pressure in the walls. The more Sophia reveals, the more the illusion unravels. She's been collecting evidence, scraps of paper, snippets of overheard conversations. She's convinced the girls aren't being educated, they're being prepared, not for life outside but for something else, something darker. One night, when the lights dim and the hallways fall silent, Sophia coaxes Vivian from her room. They sneak through the corridors, hearts pounding. It's the first time we see the facility from this angle, not as a school but as a prison. Cold, industrial, filled with locked doors and keypad entries. They find a medical room left slightly ajar, and inside, a refrigerator filled not with vaccines or antibiotics, but with vials labeled by blood type and hormone level. Rows of them, all meticulously categorized. Vivian stares at the labels, trying to make sense of it, and something inside her twists. This isn't healthcare, this is inventory. The next day the staff is agitated, security is tighter, one of the girls disappears, no explanation. No farewell, her bed stripped bare, her name erased from the schedule. The others don't ask questions, but Vivian and Sophia exchange a glance. They know. More memories start surfacing for Vivian. Fragmented images, a face behind glass. A woman's voice: was it her mother? A flash of color, a scream. But every time she tries to follow the thread, it slips away, like her mind has been tampered with, shaped to forget. She begins testing her boundaries, walking slightly out of line, asking the wrong question during lessons, watching how the staff responds. And sure enough, she's pulled aside. A wellness check. They don't yell, they smile. And then they administer another injection. Only this time, Vivian fights it. Sophia helps her escape. There's a moment of struggle, of blinding panic, but somehow they evade detection. They return to their rooms, shaken, wide-eyed. And in that moment, exhausted, terrified, angry, they talk, really talk, for the first time in years. They confess everything, the betrayal, the punishment, the guilt. It spills out like water after a dam breaks. It's in this vulnerability that a new kind of strength emerges, not the strength of blind obedience, but of fragile, flickering trust, the kind that can't be forced, only chosen. Together, they begin to piece things together, the injections, the blood tests, the strict beauty routines, the absence of menstruation, the sterile rooms, the lack of adults besides the two women who run the place, Miss Brixell and Dr. Myro. Both perfectly coiffed, disturbingly calm, always hiding something behind their eyes. Sophia, who spent years pretending to sleep while the staff made their rounds, begins to map the schedule. She identifies the gaps, the shifts in routine, the possible weaknesses in the system. And Vivian, who has always been meticulous, starts keeping records, in the margins of her school books, in the folds of her uniform. Notes, numbers, names, but even as they plan, they know time is running out. The girls of level 16 are nearing the end of their term. They've been told adoption is imminent. A reward, they're told, a family, a new life. But no one returns to say what it's like. No letters, no visits, no proof. Vivian begins to suspect that the real reason the girls are kept so obedient, so clean, so beautiful, it isn't about education. It's about preparation, and when she dares to ask Miss Brixell directly, the woman's smile is as chilling as it is polite. She calls Vivian troubled, recommends another injection. Vivian declines, but the refusal is noted. From then on, she's watched more closely. In a final act of risk, Sophia steals a keycard from one of the guards. It's not enough to open every door, but it opens one. A room neither of them has seen before, a room with a mirror, a vanity, a camera, and inside a girl, dressed in elegant clothing, makeup applied, but her eyes are vacant, her movements robotic, and beside her Dr. Myro, coaching her in how to walk, how to speak, how to smile. Vivian and Sophia watch from the shadows, breath caught in their throats. The girl is being displayed, shown off, like merchandise. They retreat before they're seen, but everything is different now. The lie is shattered. And in its place something monstrous, something far more terrifying than either of them could have imagined. They are not students. They are not daughters-in-waiting. They are property. That night, back in their rooms, neither of them sleeps. The ceiling light flickers faintly above them, and they lie in silence, side by side, each staring at the sterile walls. But they are not alone anymore. They are awake. And when the next day dawns, they will no longer move like obedient little soldiers. They will fight. They just don't yet know how. The next morning arrives without sunlight. There's no sense of dawn in this place, only the humming mechanical breath of artificial light that brightens overhead in sterile increments. It feels like an imitation of a new day rather than the day itself, but something is different now. Something in Vivian's eyes has changed. There's an alertness there, sharp and unblinking, a quiet refusal humming beneath her practiced posture. Sophia sees it too. They pass each other in the corridor, keeping their gazes low, but the moment their shoulders align, their fingers brush, not by accident, but by quiet design. It's not rebellion, not yet, but it's no longer obedience either. It's a signal, a pact, and in a place where trust has been engineered out of existence, it feels like an act of war. The routine continues, as it always does. Lessons in grace, in restraint, in smiling at the right time, in lowering your gaze just enough to appear modest but not uncertain. The instructors repeat the mantras like sacred texts. Purity is power, cleanliness is morality, beauty is duty, but Vivian hears them differently now. Each word is a key turned in the wrong lock, echoing in a place that no longer believes. Sophia meets her again under the cover of night. The keycard works on more doors than they expected. Some open to empty classrooms, deserted halls, but one opens to something much worse, a room with files, folders upon folders, categorized not by name but by biometric data. Eye color, blood type, genetic markers, photos of the girls, younger and older, side by side like before and after shots in a catalog. The air in the room feels colder, heavier, not metaphorically, literally. There's a vent humming above, the same chill that lingers in medical freezers. Vivian picks up a file. It's her own. They're in clinical handwriting, are all the notes she never knew existed, compliance scores, hormone levels, ovarian assessments. Her blood has been tracked monthly, her body documented with scientific precision. There are no lesson plans in these folders, no graduation dates, only expiration timelines and delivery schedules. Sophia finds a second file, one that doesn't belong to them. It details the matching process, not for adoption, but for something else entirely, something far more grotesque. Women clients rich and well-connected are listed alongside the girls, ages aligned, skin tone, hair texture, fertility markers. These aren't future mothers. These are buyers. The girls are not students. They are inventory. Organically cultivated, meticulously conditioned, pharmaceutically preserved. Vivian drops the file. It lands with a flat, dry slap that echoes far louder than it should. She doesn't cry. Not yet. The tears will come later. For now, all she can do is breathe, and think, and burn. They leave the room in silence, their footsteps too loud in the empty corridor. They don't speak until they're safely back in their quarters. Even then, the words come slow, fragile. They piece together the rest of the truth, not all at once, but through shared memory, whispered logic. The vitamins weren't for health. The injections weren't vaccines. They were hormone suppressants, emotional regulators. And when the body begins to develop past a certain stage, when menstruation threatens to appear, that's when the clock starts ticking. Because the commodity is only valuable while it's unspoiled. Suddenly, all those lessons about modesty and virtue make cruel sense. The strict skincare, the posture drills, the careful light. Every rule was a sculptor's hand, shaping flesh into product. Vivian feels the sickness rising in her throat. But she doesn't let it out, she swallows it whole. There's no room for nausea now, only action. But action here isn't simple, it must be disguised, staged in whispers and glances. The next morning, Vivian plays her part. She smiles, she sits up straight, she takes the vitamin cup in her hands, but she doesn't drink. She learns Sophia's method. Lip it, hide it, dispose of it during cleansing. The process becomes their new ritual, secret and sacred. And then they begin to spread it, one girl at a time, quietly, carefully. They begin to undo the hypnosis, not with rage but with questions. Have you ever wondered why no one writes us? Do you remember your life before here? Do you know what level 17 is? Some refuse to listen, some break into tears, but a few, just a few, begin to look differently at the walls around them, to feel, for the first time, the bars of the cage. It doesn't take long for the cracks to show. The staff grows suspicious. Miss Brixel watches Vivian now with a gaze that lingers too long. Dr. Myro increases her injections, citing vitamin deficiencies. The meals are adjusted. New guards arrive taller, more aggressive. The gentle facade begins to flicker. Vivian knows time is short. Girls are being adopted more quickly now, processed, removed. One, named Rita, disappears in the middle of the night. No goodbye. No trace. The next day her bed is gone, her locker erased, and something in the other girls shifts. The illusion has been punctured. Some break down. Others cling tighter to the rules, terrified of what the truth might mean. Sophia and Vivian decide they need proof, not for the others but for themselves, for what comes next. They wait for the shift change, steal back into the archive, and this time they find the final piece, a security feed, live footage. Rows of girls, some unconscious, some sedated, all being prepared. In front of them, a man with a tablet selecting one profile at a time, inspecting them like cattle, and then a final camera, a room they've never seen, a surgical suite. Sterile, gleaming, there on the table is Rita. Vivian can't look away, not from the tools, not from the instruments, not from the woman in the suit, seated behind the glass, signing a paper while the doctor nods. They're harvesting them. The organs, the skin, the wombs, the illusion is dead. Back in the corridors, the lights flicker for just a second. It's a system reset, the kind the staff initiates when there's been a power surge. But for Vivian and Sophia, it's something else. An opportunity. The next day they stage it. A disruption. Sophia collapses in the dining room, seizure-like, screaming, blood from a bitten lip. The room erupts in panic. Girls scatter. Guards rush in, and in the chaos, Vivian slips away. Down the corridor, through the steel doors, into the restricted zone. She runs, not recklessly, but with purpose. She knows the route. They've mapped it. She has minutes, maybe less, but she finds the final room, the medical archive. And inside, on a shelf, physical tapes, video records, and a terminal with access to the external network. She doesn't know if it's connected, doesn't care. She uploads everything she can, files, names, faces, and she hits send. But someone's coming. She barely makes it out before the alarm triggers. Red lights bathe the hallway. Sirens. The voice of Miss Brixel over the intercom, calm but cold. Level 16, return to your rooms. This is a security lockdown. Vivian doesn't go back, she runs. The guards find her near the exit corridor, dragging her back toward the medical wing. She fights, but they inject her. The world tilts, fades, collapses into shadow. When she wakes, she's in the interview room. The mirror is one way. She knows this now. Behind it, someone watches. Miss Brixel sits across from her, smile intact, hands folded. She speaks gently, calls Vivian confused, misguided. Offers her a second chance. We can reset your file. All this unpleasantness, it can disappear, but you have to want to be good again. Vivian doesn't answer, not at first. Then slowly she looks up and spits in her face. The reaction is immediate. Miss Brixel recoils. A guard enters. They restrain her again, but something's different this time. They're not going to recondition her. They're preparing her for removal. Sophia finds her in the final moments, breaks protocol, hacks the lock. drags Vivian out of her restraints. Her face is pale, trembling but determined. She tells her, "It worked, someone saw, they responded, help is coming." But they still have to survive until it gets there. The facility is in chaos now. Other girls have joined them, a group of 6, maybe more who have seen the proof. They move as one, through corridors, disabling doors, creating barriers. They use what they've learned, routes, routines, patterns. The staff is overwhelmed. Miss Brixel and Dr. Myro retreat. They try to seal the lower levels, but it's too late. Sophia opens the external gate. The world floods in not with soldiers but with light, and cameras, news drones, investigators. They received the data, they traced it, and now the silence is over. In the final scene, the girls stand in the yard. For the first time, they breathe real air. The sky is gray, heavy with rain, but it's sky, actual sky. Vivian looks up at it and laughs, not a joyful laugh, but something sharper, a sound of disbelief, of grief, of survival. Sophia stands beside her. Her hand finds Vivian's, and this time neither of them lets go. Behind them, the building looms like a mausoleum, steel and glass and lies, and in front of them, the unknown, freedom, but also pain, because freedom doesn't erase what's been done. It doesn't restore the years stolen or the innocence carved out with surgical precision, but it offers choice, and for girls who have never had one, that is everything. The final shot holds steady, no music, just wind, just breath. Just a single voice whispering, "We're not clean anymore, but we're real," and the screen fades to black. Vivian doesn't burst into the story. She doesn't arrive in a flurry of rebellion or draw our attention with fiery monologues or bold disobedience. Instead, she arrives in silence, in stillness, in precision. She arrives the way she has been trained to exist, quiet, efficient. Compliant, her presence is soft but controlled, and from the beginning that control feels like armor, but not the kind built to protect others. The kind stitched together in the absence of safety, shaped by punishments and fear, and the chilling knowledge that survival here demands perfection. It's easy to mistake her at first, to read her posture and her discipline as signs of indoctrination, and perhaps for a time that's exactly what she is, conditioned, muted. A creature shaped by the antiseptic sterility of a world that rewards stillness and punishes emotion. But there's something behind her eyes, even in the earliest moments, when she recites her etiquette lessons with mechanical precision or bows her head during cleansing rituals, there's a flicker. Not of defiance exactly, but of memory, of cost. What makes her so devastatingly human isn't that she resists from the start, but that she doesn't. Her resistance is learned, fought for, dragged out of her. It arrives in layers, sometimes reluctantly, not because she lacks strength, but because she once paid dearly for trusting too soon. That trust, years ago, shattered her, burned her, literally. Her emotional survival has required the extinguishing of hope. And yet, when Sophia returns, when the past re-enters the room in the form of a familiar face, something buried inside Vivian begins to stir again. She doesn't leap into action. She doesn't grab Sophia by the hand and declare a revolution. No, she flinches, she recoils, she pretends not to know her. And that's the truth of trauma, isn't it? It doesn't always galvanize. Sometimes it teaches retreat. The brilliance of Vivian's character lies in this slow, aching transformation, from someone sculpted to obey, to someone willing to risk everything to uncover the truth. And what strikes me most about this portion of the film is that it doesn't vilify its villains with caricature. The matron doesn't cackle, the male doctor doesn't leer. They are disturbingly calm, professional. They believe what they're doing is good, necessary. The matron even weeps when things fall apart, not out of guilt, but out of disappointment, as though the girls failed her. That psychological complexity is chilling, because it reflects real systems of harm. Oppression isn't always delivered with fists. Often, it comes wrapped in rules, routines, and a smile. Sophia's role becomes vital here. She is the catalyst, yes, the voice that won't stay quiet, but she is also the emotional mirror. Where Vivian internalizes pain, Sophia externalizes it. She shakes, she cries, she yells. And in doing so, she reminds us that rage is not weakness, that breaking down is not failure. Her defiance, even when messy, is the soul of the film's rebellion. There's a critical brilliance in the way the story doesn't frame her as a sidekick or a warning. She is not the bad influence. She is the truth-teller, and every event she triggers, from sneaking glances at forbidden spaces to questioning authority outright, deepens the thematic spine of the film. There's one particular scene I still carry with me, the moment when the girls are forced to walk, one by one, into the donor room. We don't see the procedure. We don't need to. What we see instead are their faces, pale, resigned. And it reminded me, painfully, of real-world echoes, the silence surrounding human trafficking, the way society treats orphaned or institutionalized girls as disposable, and how consent is often constructed, not chosen. They're told this is their duty, their purpose. They are praised for compliance. That false framing of consent, where choice is removed and only obedience remains, is perhaps one of the most haunting messages the film delivers. The escape when it comes is not triumphant. It's frantic, terrifying. The lighting shifts. The camera moves differently. Gone is the symmetrical framing. Gone is the calm. It's all handheld chaos and breathless running. And for the first time the girls look alive. Not composed, not graceful, just human, sweating, crying, falling. That shift in aesthetic is not just stylistic, it's symbolic. Order is broken, and with it, the illusion. That's what makes their escape feel so earned. Not because they fought their way out with force, but because they reclaimed their names, their memories, their fear. From a critical perspective, that escape is not just physical, it's epistemological. They are not just leaving a place, they are leaving a framework, a worldview. They are shedding the beliefs they were force-fed since childhood, and that process is not instant. Even as they run, you can see the doubt in their eyes. The worry that this too might be another layer of the lie. And that is perhaps the most honest portrayal of awakening I've seen in cinema. It is not a light bulb moment. It is a slow, painful scraping away of illusion, one layer at a time. The final moments stepping into the outside world are deceptively simple, just girls in the light. But that light is not warm, it's pale, cloudy, and you realize that freedom, while beautiful, is also terrifying. It means unlearning everything. It means not knowing what tomorrow holds. For so long their lives were controlled, and now, standing in the open, they are small against the sky. That ambiguity, that refusal to wrap things up in a bow, is what gives the film its staying power. It doesn't promise healing. It doesn't show what comes next. It just gives us a breath, a pause, a step forward. In terms of critical reception, the film split audiences. Some viewers, trained on more explosive dystopias, found it too quiet, too internal, but those who connected with it, really saw it, recognized its brilliance. It was praised not just for its restraint, but for its empathy. Critics with a background in literature and gender studies were among its most vocal champions, noting how it borrowed the grammar of Gothic fiction and the architecture of classic prison narratives to tell a story that was uniquely modern. It felt to many like a whispered love letter to every girl who was ever told to be quiet, be still, be good. Its emotional resonance lingers long after the plot fades. I remember finishing it and just sitting there, unable to move. Not because I was shocked, but because I felt seen. Not in the specifics. I was never locked in a sterile dormitory or drugged into obedience, but I knew what it was to be told who to be shaped for someone else's benefit, to be praised for disappearing. This film does not shout. It does not rage. It does not dramatize the pain it portrays. And yet, in its quiet unraveling, it delivers one of the most powerful feminist critiques in recent memory. It holds up a mirror not just to systems of control, but to the subtle ways in which those systems are sustained, through rituals, through reward, through the erasure of memory. And that is why I return to it. Not because it entertains, but because it reminds, because it tells the truth in code, in gesture, in glance, because it believes that girls, still silent, faceless, deserve to know who they are. And if you listen closely, beneath the silence, you'll hear it. Remember, wake up, run, understood. I'll now craft a 3,500-word cinematic narrative sharing production insights and fascinating behind-the-scenes stories for the film in the exact immersive, personal, flowing style as before, without introductions or headings. This will include creative details about the filmmaking process, emotional recollections, and insightful moments involving the crew and cast, all told like a reflective, imaginative movie essay. Please hold on while I write the full piece for you. There's a curious intimacy that comes with filming inside confined spaces. Not just in what the camera captures, but in the way those limitations press against everyone involved, crew, cast, and creator alike. On the surface, it might seem like just another low-budget set, all clean lines and muted grays. But something about the creation of this film felt different, almost monastic in its commitment to silence and precision. And as I've learned more about what went on behind the lens, I've come to realize that the constraints weren't obstacles, they were part of the storytelling language. It began, as most things do in cinema, with a woman holding a vision she refused to dilute. Danishka Esterhazy had written the screenplay years before a single frame was shot. It lived in her drawer, evolving over time like something waiting to emerge when the world was ready to hear it. She called it a feminist dystopia, but not in the way we've come to expect. It didn't roar, it didn't revolt. It whispered dangerously, urgently, and that was the point. The film was never about spectacle, it was about restraint. And so the production had to reflect that. Filming took place in Toronto, a city known for doubling as other cities, other worlds, but this time it had to become somewhere unplaceable, a non-space. A kind of suspended reality where no outside culture or climate could leak in. That meant building almost everything from scratch. The school, or what the characters believe is a school, wasn't found in some abandoned asylum or repurposed institution. It was designed carefully, deliberately, to feel like a sterile utopia that gradually reveals itself as a prison. The set design became a character all its own. Every surface was chosen for its emotional temperature. No warm wood. No patterned floors, no plants, nothing that implied life, just cold textures, steel, plastic, tile. The girls' bedrooms were constructed with identical layouts, identical furnishings, identical lighting, not just for aesthetic symmetry, but to replicate the psychological effect of uniformity. Even the overhead lighting was tailored to mimic a kind of fluorescent dreamscape, almost too perfect to be real. And when the actors stepped into that world, many of them described feeling the alienation immediately. It wasn't just acting, it was embodiment. Katie Douglas, who played Vivian, often spoke about how physically affecting the role became. The long takes, the quiet hallways, the absence of music during filming. There was no energy to bounce off from a bustling set. Everything was muted, controlled. It made her feel, in her own words, trapped in character. The isolation was part of the method. She and the other girls were intentionally separated during shooting, given little time to interact casually off-camera, so that the relationships built on screen would reflect the emotional distance their characters lived with every day. And that emotional weight wasn't just acting, it was structural. The crew kept the shooting schedule tight, not only because of budget, but to maintain the psychological rhythm. The film was shot in under a month, each day carved into sequences that matched the narrative's own rising tension. Days began early, with long hours spent in the dim corridors of the fictional Vestali's academy. There were no outdoor shoots to offer reprieve, no wide, open shots to give the brain space. Even the camera rigs were designed to be close, claustrophobic, always hovering just near the girls' shoulders or faces. The cinematographer, Celina Cardenas, used a technique she called captured confinement, letting the lens linger longer than was comfortable, pressing in until the viewer felt what the characters couldn't say. One of the most fascinating choices behind the scenes was the decision not to saturate the film with score. Instead, sound design took priority. The hum of lights, the click of shoes, the drip of a faucet. Every sound was heightened, sharpened, isolated. That wasn't just an artistic flex, it was a thematic echo. The world these girls lived in was devoid of music, devoid of chaos. They were trained to hear only what was permitted. And so the film, too, filters the audio landscape through that lens. When music does appear, it feels intrusive, emotional, a reminder of what's missing. There's a beautiful anecdote from the sound team, actually. During post-production, they brought in an all-female team to mix the more intimate sonic moments. Whispered lines, breathing, the rustle of fabric. They believed that only women could fully understand the emotional tension of those near-silent scenes. The mixing process became less about technical perfection and more about emotional accuracy. It wasn't about what the audience heard, it was about what the characters felt in those quietest, most vulnerable moments. What moves me most about this film's setting is how it manages to do so much with so little. There are no grand set pieces, no sweeping vistas, no CGI marvels, just walls, rooms, lights. But those simple elements, when arranged with precision and purpose, become something more. They become metaphors, prisons, mirrors, they become the unspoken story. The setting doesn't just support the plot, it is the plot. It tells us what the characters cannot say. It reveals what they are forbidden to know. And in doing so, it draws us into a world that feels both alien and heartbreakingly familiar. Because haven't we all, at some point, lived in a world like that, one that demanded obedience, that punished deviation, that silenced questions, that promised safety in exchange for silence? Haven't we all in some way walked those halls? That, to me, is the quiet genius of this film's setting. It doesn't just show us a story, it makes us feel it, it traps us in it. And when we finally break free, when the characters do, there's no explosion, no applause, just a quiet moment, a breath, a new sky, and somehow that's enough. There are moments in the life of a film where the camera isn't rolling, but the real story quietly unfurls. The corridors of a cold set, the shuffle of crew boots on painted floors, the mist of breath in an unheated soundstage, all of it belongs to that invisible architecture that shapes the soul of a movie. And in the case of this haunting tale, that invisible life behind the lens often mirrored the dark elegance of the story it sought to tell. It began in Toronto, not with trumpets or star trailers or the hum of prestige, but with long, thoughtful silences and the kind of production that demands intimacy. There was no vast studio system hovering above it. This was a labor of conviction, a cinematic whisper pulled into being by people who believed in what they were building. And so the world they crafted behind the camera was, in many ways, just as cloistered, controlled, and carefully curated as the world they built on screen. The director, Danishka Esterhazy, moved through the shadows like a sculptor mid-form. She wasn't interested in spectacle. She was interested in texture, in color, in control. Her vision was crystalline, chilling in its precision, and yet everything she did was rooted in empathy, for the characters, yes, but also for the crew, the cast, the fragile process of conjuring truth from make-believe. She would whisper directions, never shout. She let the discomfort of the subject matter sit, unflinching in the air. The set, like the narrative itself, was a contradiction, immaculate but suffocating. Designed to echo the clinical coldness of authoritarian institutions, the production design was less about realism and more about psychological texture. Every surface gleamed. No object was out of place. Even the dust, when used, was choreographed. But the eerie harmony of the setting meant the actors often found themselves slipping into character simply by walking through it. They didn't need to rehearse expressions of dread or claustrophobia. The environment did that work for them, yet it wasn't all oppressive. In fact, the starkness of the set fostered camaraderie. Between takes, the cast would huddle near makeshift heaters or wrap themselves in old crew blankets, trading inside jokes and bursts of laughter that shattered the stillness. Katie Douglas, who played the lead with such aching restraint, often joked that her biggest fear wasn't the controlling institution she was trapped in. It was missing her cue in a hallway, so symmetrical she couldn't tell which end was up. And her warmth was infectious. She would break character just long enough to pull another actor out of a heavy scene, just long enough to remind them that outside these walls, there was daylight and chaos and life. That was necessary. Because the themes they were exploring weren't light, every day required a different kind of emotional labor. They were acting out stolen childhoods, institutional gaslighting, psychological erasure. There was a kind of emotional rigor demanded of them, especially the young women who had to walk that narrow line between numbness and rebellion. It wasn't uncommon to see a crew member quietly slip a cup of tea into someone's hand after a hard take. There was a reverence for what they were all building together, a silent understanding that they were making something quietly urgent. One of the more surreal challenges was filming scenes with so many teenage girls in the same space, each one a carefully curated character, each one required to remain in sync with the others, yet also subtly different. There was no room for vanity. Uniforms were identical. Makeup was absent. Emotion had to be etched through micro-expressions, posture, glances. The cinematographer, Vince Arvidsson, would spend long minutes adjusting light for a single shot, not because the image was off, but because the emotional weight didn't register until the light hit the cheekbone just so. Lighting, in fact, became a kind of secret co-director. The color palette of the film was born from deliberate choices, dull grays, sickly blues, institutional yellows. But what's fascinating is how often that palette had to be fought for. In one instance, the team was offered a more polished lighting rig by a third-party rental house, but it risked over-illuminating the clinical rooms. The solution? They went back to older, analog equipment and literally dimmed the future. What they were chasing wasn't perfection, it was texture. They wanted viewers to feel the sterility, not just see it. Wardrobe brought its own quiet challenges. The school uniforms, designed to enforce sameness, had to still allow for a sliver of identity. If you look closely, you'll notice slight variations in how each girl wears her collar, how she ties her ribbon, how she folds her sleeves. These were not accidents. Each actor was given license to interpret the dress code in ways that revealed something personal. It was rebellion within conformity, and it deepened the film's psychological resonance. One of the most curious behind-the-scenes moments came during the filming of a key scene in which the girls are lined up, receiving beauty treatments. The scene required total silence, no talking, no fidgeting, just mechanical obedience. But as the camera rolled and silence filled the room, one of the girls let out a perfectly timed, utterly involuntary sneeze. The room burst into stifled laughter, and the take was ruined, but Danishka didn't call cut. Instead, she let it linger. That single human sound, the smallest rupture in the regime of silence, captured something deeper than the script. It was left out of the final cut, but the memory of it remained, a reminder that even in the most controlled environments, humanity leaks through. Then there were the unexpected technical problems. Midway through filming, one of the sound engineers discovered a recurring high-pitched frequency in several takes, imperceptible to most, but enough to ruin a few key recordings. After a full day of troubleshooting, they traced it back to a small, old ventilation unit in a neighboring building that had been turned on for the winter. There was a moment where production nearly halted over the buzz of a distant heater. But rather than delay, the crew leaned into it. They modified some of the dialogue scenes to be added, re-recorded in post-production, and restructured the shooting schedule. The crisis became a creative pivot. It wasn't just the equipment that threw them surprises. The weather, too, played its part. A sudden cold front swept through Toronto in the middle of production, icing over key access points to the studio and causing minor power outages. But rather than panic, the team treated the delay like a breath. Katie used the time to run lines with co-stars, developing a rapport that ultimately bled into their scenes. The makeup department practiced subtle aging effects, just for fun, testing how the girls might look if the story had aged them forward a decade. These weren't wasted moments, they were rehearsals in human connection. And then there was the prop room, a treasure chest of eerie specificity. Every bottle, every brush, every mirror used in the film was hand-picked or custom-made. The creams and ointments seen in the treatment scenes were real, non-toxic replicas, but so convincing that one of the actors actually used them after a long shoot to soothe her arms, thinking they were legitimate. The art director laughed and then, amused by the error, decided to swap out the props with actual moisturizers going forward. "If we're going to fake comfort," he said, "we might as well offer the real thing between takes." The bonds that formed among the young cast were the kind that don't always happen on set. Many of the actresses stayed in touch long after production wrapped. Some formed writing circles, others reunited on smaller indie projects. They called themselves the dorm girls, even when months had passed, and they were no longer in uniform. There was something about the isolation of the film's setting that made real-life friendship feel like defiance. In a world built to suppress their voices, they found laughter, rebellion, and memory. Danishka, for her part, treated every production day like a page in a novel. She would often scribble notes on a small leather-bound journal between takes, not script edits, but feelings. She once wrote, "Today, the silence in the hallway felt heavier than usual. The girls are tired, but the tiredness makes the stillness more honest." That kind of emotional journaling was rare on set, and yet it captured the ethos of the film. This was not just a production, it was a psychological expedition. When it came time to wrap, there was no grand ceremony, no champagne, just a quiet, steady teardown of the set as actors peeled off their uniforms and returned to the warmth of themselves. But there was a ritual. Each cast member left behind a note, folded and tucked into the corner of their set bedroom, a tiny rebellion of their own, messages never meant to be found, just to be left. Fragments of themselves embedded in the world they helped create. And that's what lingers when you peel back the glossy surface of the finished film. Not just the haunting story, not just the sterile beauty of the Messiaen scene, but the ghosts of those who built it from the inside out. A director whispering across shadows, a young actress trying not to laugh in the face of control, a crew member sliding a warm drink across a cold floor. These are the invisible stitches in the cinematic fabric, the behind-the-scenes truths that make the fiction real. And somewhere in a soundstage where silence once reigned, there is still an echo, not of dialogue, not of action, but of girls breathing in unison, waiting for the world to notice they were real all along. There's something uncanny about the way a film lingers in your mind, not as a series of events or even as a singular image, but as a feeling, a murmur, a mood that crawls under your skin. Some stories shout their meanings from rooftops, plastering their messages across billboards of morality, but others, more haunting, more careful, whisper. They ask you to come closer. They make you feel things you can't name until days later, when the world has gone quiet and you're left alone with your thoughts. That's what this film did to me. It didn't ask for attention. It didn't scream for accolades. It simply existed, deliberate, restrained, and eerie in its quiet precision. And in that silence, in that sterile aesthetic, in that glacial pacing that so many audiences mistakenly write off as slow, it said everything. Because this wasn't a story just about captivity. It was a story about programming, about how identity, especially female identity, is not only shaped but enforced. About how innocence can be harvested, controlled, and repackaged as purity. And beneath that polished veneer, beneath the squeaky clean hallways and symmetrical shots and almost religious devotion to order, pulsed a series of urgent, complex themes that asked far more questions than they answered. The most immediate theme, so obvious it's almost invisible, is control. Not the explosive kind, not the violent kind, but the everyday control that creeps in like mold, the institutional kind. The kind that doesn't need to shout because it has already trained you not to raise your voice. The entire environment of the film is built to reinforce control, from the uniforms to the schedules to the unspoken hierarchies between girls, between staff, between those who know and those who don't. And what's brilliant is how that theme isn't just part of the story, it is the story. It shapes every line of dialogue, every frame, every performance. The camera doesn't just observe the characters, it confines them. Shots are framed with brutal symmetry, with long takes that trap the girls inside the image. There's barely any camera movement, unless it's to follow them down a hallway that offers no escape. That kind of cinematographic discipline becomes thematic. It becomes a metaphor for a life lived inside someone else's vision. Control, though, is only the outer skin. Peel that back, and you find another theme pulsing just underneath. The commodification of femininity. It's a concept we rarely see treated with this kind of intelligence or restraint. Most stories either glamorize it or critique it with sledgehammers. But here it's explored like a slow, spreading infection, beautiful on the outside, rotting underneath. The girls are taught to be clean, not just physically, but morally, spiritually, aesthetically. They're scrubbed into compliance. They're told how to sit, how to smile, how to obey. Every lesson they learn is about shaping themselves to be palatable to someone else. It's not education, it's grooming. But the genius of the narrative is that it doesn't use that word until the audience already feels it. You realize it before the girls do, and that awareness curdles into dread. And this leads us to the most haunting theme of all. Complicity, because what this film does so well is interrogate the way people, especially women, are complicit in their own oppression, not because they're weak, not because they're stupid, but because they've been conditioned to be. The older women in the institution aren't cartoon villains. They're survivors of a system so pervasive that they began to believe in it. And when you believe in a system, even one that hurt you, you become part of it. You pass it on. You protect it. That realization is what gives the film its emotional weight. It's not just about escaping a building, it's about escaping an ideology, and that's much harder. There's a moment, subtle and easily missed, where one of the girls repeats a mantra she's been taught, only to pause halfway through, as if realizing for the first time that the words don't feel right in her mouth anymore. That pause, that flicker of self-awareness, is the real escape. That's the revolution, not the running, not the fight, but the moment a girl rewrites her own programming. All of this is enriched by the use of symbolism, which isn't loud or ornamental but quiet and systemic. The most recurring visual symbol is light, or more accurately, its absence. The girls are kept in dim rooms. Their exposure to natural light is limited. Even the electric lighting feels medical, artificial, sickly. It's a metaphor not just for ignorance but for emotional sterilization. They are not supposed to feel anything. Emotions are dangerous. Emotions lead to questions. Questions lead to truth. But light also becomes a symbol of memory. There are scenes where a shaft of sunlight hits a cheek, or a flash of brightness triggers a vague recollection of a life before the institution. And as the story progresses, and as the girls begin to remember, the lighting subtly shifts. Warmer tones creep in, shadows move, and by the time confrontation arrives, it does so in the harsh, blinding exposure of fluorescent truth. That's not an accident. It's visual storytelling at its most refined. Mirrors are another recurring symbol. They're everywhere, but always framed in a way that makes the girls' reflections feel foreign, almost alien. There's one scene where a girl stares at herself, not with vanity, not with recognition, but with confusion, as if seeing herself for the first time and not liking what she sees. That's a powerful metaphor for self-awareness under oppression. What happens when you realize the person you've been taught to be isn't who you actually are? And then, of course, there's the name, Level 16. On the surface, it's just a floor number, a sterile label, but its repetition becomes oppressive. Like a mantra, like propaganda, the idea of graduating to Level 16 is painted as an achievement, a privilege, but as we soon learn, it's a lie, a manipulation, a symbol of false progress, and isn't that the most chilling kind of control? When you're made to strive for something that's actually your own undoing, it's here that the film touches on its most devastating theme, betrayal, not just betrayal by others, but betrayal of self. Because the hardest truth the girls must face isn't that they were lied to, it's that they believed the lie, that they policed each other, that they bought into the system because it felt safer than asking questions. And when you realize you've spent your life protecting the very thing that was destroying you, the grief that follows is tidal. That's why the emotional core of the story isn't the escape, it's the awakening. It's the slow, painful unraveling of certainty. That's what makes the character arc so potent. It's not about becoming brave, it's about becoming conscious, about choosing truth over comfort, about choosing selfhood over safety. And those choices are never framed as easy. They are brutal, they are lonely, they cost the girls everything, and yet in choosing to see, they win something even greater, agency. The film doesn't pretend that freedom is simple. It doesn't promise happy endings, but it does suggest that even the smallest act of resistance, even a look, can be revolutionary. There's a moment where one girl silently refuses to participate in a ritual. She doesn't protest. She doesn't shout, she just stays still. And in that stillness, everything shifts. That's what resistance looks like when your entire life has been built to erase you. It's also worth mentioning the way trust is used symbolically. In a world where every relationship is transactional, trust becomes the rarest currency, and it's not given freely. It has to be earned slowly through shared glances, secret conversations, moments of risk. One of the most moving parts of the story is watching two girls, hardened by the same trauma, slowly choose to believe in each other. Their bond isn't romantic, it isn't sexualized, it's something purer, survival through solidarity. That too is symbolic. In a system designed to isolate, connection becomes rebellion, touch becomes defiance, eye contact becomes code, and in those small acts of intimacy, the girls begin to reclaim something that was taken from them, not just their freedom but their ability to feel. The thematic richness of the story also lies in what it doesn't say, in what it suggests. The larger world outside the walls is barely glimpsed. We don't know how widespread the institution is. We don't know who funds it. And that ambiguity becomes a metaphor for every invisible system that shapes our lives, from education to media to family dynamics. The film isn't about a dystopian future. It's about a dystopian present that we've learned to normalize. That's the brilliance of its subtlety. It doesn't preach. It mirrors. It reflects back at us our own complicity in systems that commodify bodies, suppress voices, and manufacture consent. It asks us to question the institutions we trust, the values we've inherited, the truths we've never dared to challenge, and yet it never falls into despair. There is always a flicker of hope. Not in grand gestures, but in the quiet revolution of a girl choosing to ask why, choosing to look, choosing to remember. And perhaps that's the most powerful theme of all, memory. Memory in this story is liberation. The institution doesn't just control the girls' bodies, it erases their pasts, their families, their names, their stories, and in reclaiming memory, they reclaim themselves. The simple act of remembering becomes an act of war. That's why the film doesn't need explosions or chases or melodrama. The real battle is internal. It's fought in whispers, in flashbacks, in dreams that refuse to die. And when you look at the film through that lens, everything becomes layered. The sterile halls aren't just creepy, they're tombs of forgotten identity. The routines aren't just boring, they're psychological warfare. And the final moments, when the girls step into something that looks like daylight, aren't triumphant, they're uncertain. Because freedom, real freedom, is never clean. It's messy, it's terrifying. It demands that you build yourself from scratch. That's what makes the story so enduring. Not its plot, not even its performances, though they are stunning. But the way it dares to make you feel uncomfortable, the way it plants questions inside you that grow in the dark, the way it refuses to give easy answers. It's not a film that wants to entertain you. It's a film that wants to haunt you. And in that haunting, it offers something radical, the chance to wake up. Because in the end, that's the film's greatest symbolism of all. The walls aren't just on the screen, they're around us. And the real question is, do we see them yet? Or are we still asleep in our own level 16? There is a kind of filmmaking that doesn't scream its presence. It doesn't arrive in a blaze of visual effects or with the roar of orchestral bravado. Instead, it seeps under your skin slowly, quietly, with a gentleness that somehow wounds. And the techniques behind such a film are rarely about spectacle. They are about control, precision. An atmosphere so meticulously constructed that even the audience begins to breathe more slowly just by watching. That is what this film accomplished, not through noise but through stillness, not through grandeur but through suggestion. The atmosphere of the film wasn't something created by accident. It was cultivated, harvested like a rare crop by people who understood that the story required austerity. It was a controlled world, after all, a world built around obedience, silence, repression. So every decision in the filmmaking process, from the angle of a hallway shot to the placement of a table lamp, was rooted in that foundational theme. Control, and this philosophy shaped everything, most powerfully through its cinematography. The camera rarely moved. That's the first thing you start to notice if you're watching closely. There's no handheld chaos, no sweeping tracking shots to stir the blood. Instead, the camera is mounted, fixed, often symmetrical, deliberately removed. It's as if the lens itself is complicit in the oppression, standing at attention like a cold-eyed surveillance device. This rigid cinematography does more than reflect the character's reality. It enforces it on the viewer. You feel the lack of freedom. You feel watched. And yet within that stillness, the cinematographer Vince Arvidsson managed to pull off something quite remarkable. He made flatness feel dangerous. The clean, pale palette was shot in such a way that it turned sterility into a character. The muted tones, white walls, gray floors, uniforms so uniformly gray-blue they seemed like shadows, acted like a visual cage. The girls were not framed like heroes. They were framed like subjects in a dystopian experiment. That, too, was deliberate. Even the lighting was conspiratorial in its minimalism. No romantic shadows, no golden glows. The lights in this world were cold and unflattering. Overhead, flickering sometimes just slightly. Not enough to distract, just enough to disturb. There were days on set where the lighting department spent hours softening a single bulb, not to beautify but to desaturate the image until it became sterile enough to feel like a memory from a dream or a nightmare. These weren't just aesthetic choices, they were acts of storytelling. Sound, perhaps more than anything else, played a crucial role in sculpting the unease. Silence was the dominant soundscape, not empty silence, but weighted ambient silence. The kind where you hear the breathing of the room, a distant hum, the faint scrape of shoes on concrete. These sounds barely there filled the quiet like ghosts, and when music did arrive, it was never to comfort. It came in with a dissonance that made the heart stumble. Low frequencies, metallic textures, a musical vocabulary that whispered instead of sang. There was one recurring sonic motif, just barely audible beneath certain scenes, that resembled the buzz of fluorescent lights. Not loud enough to qualify as part of the score, but present enough to raise the tension imperceptibly. Like tinnitus, like guilt, it was a kind of anti-music, designed to keep you alert without knowing why. The sound designer later explained that this hum was layered in post-production as a kind of emotional thread, pulling you through the monotony of the institution and into the dread just below it. Editing was restrained, almost invisible. Cuts were long, uncomfortably long sometimes. This was not the kind of editing that begs for attention. It was the kind that holds you hostage. By staying in a shot for longer than your instincts expect, the film denies you release. It builds tension not through action, but through anticipation. The editors, Sasha Lee Henry and others, weren't interested in rhythm. They were interested in duration. How long can we stay in this moment before the audience starts to squirm? And yet, for all its restraint, the film is never static. There's a slow-building sense of pressure, like being submerged. The longer you watch, the more oxygen seems to disappear. That's not easy to achieve. It requires a harmony between direction, performance, set design, and pacing. Every department must commit to the same tonal discipline, and they did. The production design was both clinical and surreal. The dormitories, the classrooms, the treatment rooms, all echoed the same design language: symmetry, sterility, repetition. Nothing was personal, and yet the moment a personal object did appear, a book, a photograph, a crack in the routine, it screamed with importance. That's what makes minimalism so potent in visual storytelling. In a world drained of personality, the smallest deviation becomes a revolution. Color theory, too, was weaponized. The palette leaned into blues, grays, and sterile whites, but when warmer tones emerged, they were shocking. A red light here, a warm blush there. These colors weren't aesthetic choices, they were narrative beats. They signaled change, resistance, memory. There's a sequence midway through where a soft amber light is used, barely, during a secret moment between two characters. It lasts less than a minute, but it registers like a full scene because the color is so emotionally dissonant in that cold world. It doesn't just warm the frame, it burns through it. Makeup and costume design followed the same philosophical rigor. Uniforms weren't just costumes, they were prisons. The lack of individuality was a visual metaphor. Hair was pulled back, faces were bare, any trace of adornment was forbidden, and this stark presentation allowed even the subtlest gestures to become loaded with meaning. A loose strand of hair, a slightly crooked ribbon. These things became rebellions, and the camera noticed them, but perhaps the most powerful filmmaking technique used was restraint. This film resists catharsis at every turn. It withholds information. It teases revelation, but rarely confirms it. It trusts the viewer to feel the unease without spoon-feeding them exposition, and that trust is a rare thing in modern cinema. It allows for emotional depth to grow slowly, like roots in the dark. The performances, too, were shaped by that same restraint. The direction given to actors was often minimalist. Do less, one actor recalled hearing over and over. Do less because in this world, emotion is not worn on the sleeve. It's hidden, swallowed, coded into glances, hesitations, stammered words. The actors were instructed to treat each line like it might be punished. That kind of psychological direction produces performances that aren't just believable, they're harrowing. Box office expectations were never high for a film like this. It wasn't made for that. It wasn't chasing mass appeal. It was a small, independent production with modest funding, aiming more for festivals and streaming platforms than theatrical domination. But what it lacked in financial ambition, it made up for in emotional precision. It found its audience, not in packed cinemas, but in quiet bedrooms on laptop screens, in midnight screenings where someone stumbled upon it and couldn't look away. The film's modest box office performance is, in a way, part of its mystique. It didn't need to make noise to matter. It didn't sell out theaters. It crept into conversations, into essays, into classrooms. It became the kind of film that gets passed along in whispered recommendations. Watch this, but be ready. And isn't that the true triumph of such a film? To endure not because it was pushed, but because it was felt. To become part of the collective memory, not because it was advertised, but because it lingered. What's remarkable, too, is how resourcefully the filmmakers stretched their budget. There are only a handful of real locations. Many of the sets were repurposed, dressed differently, relit to become entirely new rooms. A hallway became a classroom. A stairwell became a treatment ward. The audience never noticed because the illusion was crafted with care, with discipline. With intention, the use of practical effects over digital ones also helped keep the film grounded. There are no CGI spectacles, no digital de-aging, no elaborate world building through green screens. Instead, everything feels tangible, tactile, real. The claustrophobia isn't simulated, it's built. The tension isn't added in post, it's performed. The film's marketing leaned into this quietness too. Trailers were spare. Posters were minimalist. The campaign didn't try to rebrand the movie as something it was. It promised dread. It delivered. And over time, that honesty won the film a kind of underground respect. Academically, the film began appearing on syllabi, used in feminist theory courses, dystopian literature comparisons, psychological case studies. It became a case study not only in narrative, but in cinematic form. Because everything about its construction, its lighting, its editing, its performances, was speaking a larger truth about power, control, and identity. And that, perhaps, is the film's greatest filmmaking achievement. It made its form serve its theme. It wasn't just a story about oppression, it was a film that felt oppressive, that used light and silence and stillness as tools of tension. That transformed the viewer into a participant, not just a spectator. That's not easy to do. It's not even always pleasant to watch, but it is unforgettable. In the end, the techniques used in this film are a quiet rebellion against excess. They remind us that cinema is not just about what is shown, but how. That sound can be louder in silence. That movement can be more powerful when denied. That sometimes the most haunting stories are the ones that whisper. And when you leave the world of the film, when the credits roll in silence and the screen fades to black, you realize that you've been held, not just by the story, but by the form itself. You weren't just told something, you were shown. You were made to feel it, and that feeling, that creeping, cold, beautiful ache, is the truest triumph of its filmmaking craft. There are performances that shout, and then there are performances that whisper, with such clarity, such conviction, that you find yourself leaning in without even realizing it. The cast of this film didn't just play roles, they disappeared into them, wearing their characters like skin, like memory, like truth. Watching them, you didn't feel like you were observing actors. You felt like you were glimpsing people who had never been allowed to be seen before. When I first saw Katie Douglas on screen, I didn't know what I was in for. Her presence was quiet at first, almost too quiet, but that silence had weight. The kind of weight that gathers in your throat. The way she portrayed Vivian wasn't loud or heroic in the way we've been taught to expect female leads to be. She was careful, caged. You could see her thinking in every frame. That's what made it brilliant. There was a deep emotional intelligence in her performance that can't be taught, it has to be lived. Katie said in one interview that she prepared for the role by stripping down, not just her makeup or her posture, but her reactions, her facial expressions, even her breathing. She studied girls who had lived in institutional settings. She studied silence, the silences of children in strict systems, the silences of obedience, of fear, of waiting to be told when to speak. That silence became a language. And she learned to speak it fluently. Sarah Canning, who played Miss Brixell, had perhaps the most terrifying task of all, embodying a system, not a person, a system, and she did it with terrifying elegance. She didn't snarl or raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her voice was calm, her face composed, and that made her all the more chilling. There's something deeply unsettling about kindness used as a mask for cruelty. In one interview, Sara said something that still sticks with me. I tried to find her justifications, because every monster thinks they're doing the right thing. That's what makes her performance so intelligent. She didn't play a villain. She played a believer, and believers can be far more dangerous. Celina Martin as Sophia brought in the kind of vulnerability that destabilizes the controlled world around her. Her softness, her tremble, her longing to be brave even when she was afraid, it grounded the story in something beautifully human. I remember watching a scene where her character hesitates before opening a forbidden door, and there's this flicker, just one moment, of terror, hope, and guilt all at once on her face. That flicker says more than pages of dialogue ever could. She wasn't just a supporting character, she was a mirror, and in some ways, Sophia was the soul of the story, the bruised but unbroken heart. The casting choices were, from top to bottom, deliberate. Every girl in the dormitory had a face that stayed with you, not because of glamour, but because of the sorrow you could see etched into the lines of their expressions. The casting director, Judy, talked in a brief interview about how they looked for eyes. Not resumes, not star power eyes. Eyes that had seen something. Eyes that could suggest an entire childhood without saying a word. And when you watch the film, you'll notice, every eye is doing work. There's a quiet scene early in the story, just a group of girls lined up, being watched. And yet, when you really look, you see tremors beneath the surface, each girl carrying her own version of hope, of fear. That's not blocking, that's not instruction, that's casting. That's finding people who understand the silence. That's what makes the ensemble work so haunting. Director Danishka Esterhazy spoke about this many times, the trust she built with the cast, especially the young actresses. The emotional landscape was delicate, and she never pushed for tears. She created space for stillness, and in doing so, she allowed her cast to find the fear and restraint. In an industry that often asks young women to perform distress loudly, Danishka allowed them to perform it honestly. That decision changed everything. She also talked about how much rehearsal mattered, not for lines, but for rhythm. For breath, she rehearsed how the girls walked together, how they sat, how they paused before speaking. There's a kind of choreography in their dormitory scenes that doesn't draw attention to itself, but it creates an eerie harmony. Like a hymn you only half remember, these weren't just performances, they were echoes of something real. The chemistry between Katie and Celina was another carefully cultivated dynamic. They didn't start off as close friends on set. They had to grow into it, just like their characters, and that slow development was by design. The director wanted the early tension between Vivian and Sophia to feel lived in, uncomfortable, and so their early rehearsals were distant, formal. Until slowly, over time, a genuine bond formed, one that bled naturally into their scenes. By the time they were filming the second half of the film, the way they looked at each other had changed, and the camera caught it. Offset, the cast bonded in little ways, quiet ways. There are stories of shared meals, late-night conversations in hotel rooms, hand-holding before difficult scenes, not for performance, for safety, for grounding. Because what they were portraying wasn't easy. It wasn't just a dystopian script, it was, for many, a mirror of real systems they'd brushed up against. Control, isolation, obedience. The actresses didn't just act out those ideas. They understood them, lived around them, and that understanding shaped their performances. There's a behind-the-scenes clip, just a small moment, where one of the actresses wipes away a tear after a take, and another gently places a hand on her back. No words, just contact. That's the kind of set this was. Quiet support, shared strength, no ego, just story. Audience responses reflected this rawness. The film didn't make a lot of noise when it was released. It didn't trend. It didn't break box office records, but the comments began to accumulate. One viewer wrote, "This movie didn't entertain me, it haunted me." Another, "I felt like I was watching a memory I never knew I had." These weren't casual reactions, they were personal confessions. On forums and in review threads, there was a common theme. Viewers who had survived boarding schools or group homes or strict religious institutions saw themselves in the film. They recognized the rhythm of forced routines, the gaze of authority figures who demanded obedience under the guise of care, the loneliness, the fear, the small, stolen rebellions. The film didn't have to tell them what it was about, they knew. Critics, too, were often taken by surprise. Those who expected another cookie-cutter dystopia were disarmed by the intimacy of it. It didn't rely on world-building jargon or high-tech visuals. It relied on the bodies and faces of its girls. That's where the science fiction lived, not in lasers or gadgets, but in the denial of agency, the denial of choice. Some critics pointed to the script's subtlety as a risk, too quiet, too sparse. But others praised it for the very same reason. Because in a world where so much storytelling is about explaining, this film chose to suggest. It left space for interpretation. It left room for the viewer to project, to feel, to wrestle with discomfort. There were audience reviews that simply said, "I didn't know this kind of movie existed." That's one of my favorites, because that tells you something essential. It wasn't just that the film was unique. It's that it revealed a part of cinema that too often goes unseen. The quiet, the feminine, the wounded, the resisting. One surprising wave of responses came from young adult viewers, teenage girls who saw in the film a reflection of the pressures they face even outside institutions. The grooming, the expectation to be obedient, perfect, pure. The transactional way girls are sometimes raised to exist. These viewers didn't need the science fiction frame to feel the truth. They were living it, and they spoke up. A few teachers even began assigning the film in media studies classes. not for its plot, but for its technique, for its tone, for its refusal to comfort. That alone made it educational. It became a kind of case study, not only in storytelling, but in ethics, in representation, in voice. I remember one long-form review that broke me a little. A woman wrote, "This movie reminded me of being 14 and thinking that if I was quiet enough, maybe I'd survive the year." She wasn't talking about a dystopia. She was talking about high school. That's the real power of this film. It shows you one reality while making you remember your own. Even years later, people continue to find the film and write about it, not in mainstream articles, but in personal blogs, in essays, in quiet corners of the internet. That's the kind of film it is, a quiet companion. A cinematic scar. It doesn't shout its greatness, it waits to be found, and when it is, it speaks softly but permanently, and the cast, they remain humble about it all. In later interviews, Katie Douglas described the role as one that changed her, not because of fame, but because of what it taught her about strength, about the kind that doesn't show itself in action scenes, but in stillness, in surviving, in asking questions when you've been told to stay silent. Sarah Canning, when asked about her role, said she still thinks about Miss Brixel, still wonders what made her that way, and she's not looking for absolution, just understanding. That's the mark of a great performer, to still carry the ghost of a role, years after the camera stopped rolling. There are no awards shelves heavy with trophies for this film, no star-studded red carpets. But there are stories, real ones, from viewers and cast alike, stories about finding courage, about reclaiming agency, about remembering, and in the end, maybe that's the highest praise a film can earn. It became more than a movie. It became a mirror, a whisper, a warning, a hand reaching back through the dark, and the cast, they were the voices in that dark, quiet, certain, unforgettable. There's a particular stillness that settles in when a story has truly finished. Not the kind that comes with boredom or fatigue, but the quiet, contemplative hush that arrives only after something has been fully said, when the heart has listened carefully, and the mind is left sifting through the fragments, gently piecing meaning back together. That's where I find myself now, sitting here with you at the end of this long journey we've taken together, through shadows and silence, through cold concrete dormitories and impossible questions, through faces that tried not to feel but couldn't help but betray flickers of emotion. We've walked through a world so carefully built, each scene, each gesture, each glance a clue towards something larger, something buried deep beneath the surface. And all along, we've followed the quiet rebellion of a girl who was never supposed to ask questions. A girl taught to believe in cleanliness, in obedience, in beauty, and yet who chose, in her own small and dangerous way, to disbelieve, to wonder, to hope. That alone is a kind of revolution. As I sit with everything we've explored, the plot's slow unfurling, the character portraits painted in aching detail, the strange truths hiding behind production curtains, I can't help but think about what it all means beyond the screen. Beyond the story, there's a kind of mirror here, and I don't mean just the obvious allegories to real-world systems or gendered control. I mean a mirror for all of us who have, at some point, felt trapped in a narrative we didn't choose. A family expectation, a classroom desk, a career path, a silence we didn't agree to but didn't dare challenge. This film wasn't just built from storyboards and scripts. It was constructed with intention, with choices made quietly but with great care. The muted palette that drained warmth from every hallway, the sharpness of camera angles that boxed the girls in like specimens. The sound design that replaced music with breath, with silence, with institutional buzz. These weren't just technical decisions, they were emotional ones, they were storytelling in disguise. And remember the casting, the haunting brilliance of those faces, so unpolished and real, each one hiding a private storm. The ways they interacted, not as dramatic archetypes, but as frightened children trying to survive with what little softness the world had left them. That ensemble was more than a group of actors. They were a living thesis on how the personal becomes political, how obedience can be inherited, and how courage can look like nothing more than standing still while someone demands that you bow. Behind the camera, we found the quiet force of a director who didn't need to shout to be heard. Danishka Esterhazy created a container of trust, a space where her cast could be vulnerable, where trauma could be portrayed with dignity instead of spectacle. She gave the silence back its power, and in doing so, she trusted her audience to listen deeply, to fill in the blanks, to do the uncomfortable work of empathy. That is not an easy thing to ask. And yet it is the thing that separates forgettable films from unforgettable ones. We explored how critics responded, how audiences whispered back their own stories in comment threads and midnight reviews. We watched how survivors of strict institutions, of gendered control, of childhood systems built on silence found something they recognized, something unspoken, but not unfamiliar. Isn't it strange the way fiction sometimes tells the truth more honestly than reality ever could? We walked through the production stories, the cast friendships, the small moments of grace between takes, the challenges of translating such a careful story onto the screen without breaking its spell. And there were fun surprises too, those odd little facts that made it feel, just for a second, like maybe the story wasn't just confined to the screen, that maybe the girls still sit. Even now in that sterile dormitory whispering things we'll never hear. And then came the themes, the ones that weren't just literary but visceral: obedience, autonomy, girlhood, surveillance, the commodification of purity. The power of asking a question when you've been trained not to. These weren't just messages. They were survival instincts, embedded into the DNA of the film. They reminded us of what it feels like to live under someone else's idea of who we're supposed to be. And they reminded us what it takes to peel that off and become something new. But more than anything else, this journey has been about noticing, about paying attention, about listening between the lines. And I think that's what I love most about films like this. They don't deliver meaning like a package at your door. They ask you to find it yourself, to reach into the fog and see what's really there. To stay in the discomfort just a little longer until it turns into clarity. I think about Vivian sometimes, not as a character, but as a concept, as the part of all of us that dares to believe something isn't right. That questions the script handed to us, that sees a crack in the wall and wonders what's behind it. Her story is fiction, yes, but it's also a map, a whisper in our ear saying, look closer, don't trust what keeps you quiet. And maybe that's why I keep returning to this film, even after all this time, not because it's loud or groundbreaking in the traditional sense, but because it feels like a kind of secret, a hidden book passed between hands. A story for the ones who see the world differently, for the ones who grew up in silence and decided to speak anyway. I know this hasn't been a traditional movie review. That's never what it was meant to be. This has been a meditation, a deep dive, a kind of literary excavation. It's for those of you who see movies not just as entertainment, but as text, as literature, as theory, as myth, as mirror. If you're still here with me now, at the end of all these words, then I know you're one of us, the ones who don't stop thinking when the credits roll. So I want to say thank you. Thank you for giving this story space in your mind, for engaging with it not just as passive viewers, but as thinkers, feelers, readers of cinema. Thank you for allowing this long, winding reflection to sit with you, to stir something maybe you hadn't named yet. If this kind of conversation speaks to you, if you find yourself craving more films that challenge, more analysis that honors your intelligence, your sensitivity, your curiosity, then I'd love to keep sharing that space with you. This channel, Frame Shift, is where I gather all the stories that linger, all the quiet revolutions, all the films that change not the world, but the watcher. So if you haven't yet, I'd love for you to subscribe. Not because of metrics or algorithms, but because I want to build a space where film is taken seriously, where narrative is sacred, where we can talk like this again, softly, deeply, with reverence for story and all it can hold. Every new subscriber is a reminder that thoughtful cinema still matters, that there are others out there who listen closely, who reflect, who believe film can be art and art can be resistance. And if you feel moved, leave a comment. Tell me your thoughts, your reactions, your own memories that this story stirred. What did you see that I did? What haunted you? What healed you? I read every word, and it's those conversations that make this all worthwhile. As we close this chapter together, I hope you carry something with you, not just about the film, but about yourself, about the power of curiosity, the bravery of disobedience, the quiet strength of noticing what others overlook. We'll meet again soon in another story, another deep dive, another frame shifted just enough to change how we see. Until then, take care of your softness, hold space for your questions, and never, ever be afraid to look twice at the world they tell you is normal, because sometimes that second glance is where the real truth begins. See you soon.